still love that intro.
It's a great
Uh,
intro, isn't it?
we are back after 4 months, 5 months. It's been a while.
Wasn't the
6
last one
months.
November or December, I think?
Oh
This was
no, no,
closer
no,
this
no,
time.
no. It's much older than that. It's been
No
oh
way.
so the last book club has been so yeah we've been on we've had recording since the chapter 4 was, man, I want to say it was like the summer or something. It's been a long time.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. I think yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, it's been taking a long time. Yeah, you're completely correct. I was thinking of the last time me, you, and Caleb had a stream. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're
we did
completely
we did a
correct.
thing more recently, but no chapter. So, anyways, we are finally back to
Hmm.
cover the next chapter of Jacques Maritain's Degrees of Knowledge. Uh, this time it was entirely Bulge's fault that we're running so far behind. I had this read
Absolutely.
months ago,
Yep.
and then he read it, and then I'd forgotten it by then, and
And we
yeah,
both and then it continued being my fault, and then we both had to reread it. So I think we reread this chapter like twice or something.
I think I've read it 3 times. I think that's right
Yeah,
now.
it's around that. I don't think I've read the entire chapter 3 times, but I've certainly for sections, which I've certainly reread 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, which I mean, as I think we'll both talk about. I think it deserved at least a reread and possibly a second reread because it's just like everything else that Maritain has done so far. It's been very dense but very worthwhile to really dig into. Um,
Yeah,
the
you
the one thing that
certainly.
I sort of keep coming
Mhm.
back to, it's I'm happy. I love getting to do this our book club here and sort of condense down what is a very dense text, but we can't really do it justice because we barely understand it after 2 readings. So it's absolutely worth a look at some point if anyone is inclined to lose themselves and many hours of their life in Thomistic philosophy.
Yeah, you also start noticing that a lot of Maraton's arguments are closer to sketches of arguments. He's more being expository as to the Thomistic system of epistemology and metaphysics than
Hmm.
he is a lot of the time making concrete arguments for it. But he's sketching them out. So, like, there will be, I think there was one art, like, there is, I think, a one page in this where he makes one argument for an ontological argument for God, I believe. You could draw that out into like 20 pages if you were inclined to set out to set everything out. And it's like very quick. You barely notice that he's actually
Hmm.
making this argument because it's in the service of something else about the perception of the mind and being itself, which is
Yeah, and like everything else with Maritime, or with this book at least, is he's assuming that you have, a doctorate level knowledge of Thomistic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy. So something like the proofs of the existence of God, he assumes you just know in depth by the time you're reading this. Just like you should
yeah.
also know Greek, Latin, French, German, and probably a
it
little like Hebrew as well.
it'd be correct to say that his target audience are the contemporary people he cites in his footnotes. So,
Yes,
it's
exactly.
like Garrigou Lagrange, it's the other scholastics and neo-scholastics of that period whom
Mhm.
he's discussing with. Because he does, and not in this chapter, but in other chapters and previous ones, he does actually, say, disagree with them or agree with them, but modify one statement of theirs or whatever. So he's very much in conversation with those people. And if you don't know them or you're not aware of them, you're sort of missing something out
Mhm.
at the very least.
So, as a sort of a reminder overview, because again, it's been a couple of months and we're doing a lot of things. The whole idea of degrees of knowledge. This is Maritain's magnum opus on epistemology. In the first half of the book, which we'll be concluding today, he goes over the degrees of rational knowledge. So, this is philosophy and experimental science, starting with what epistemology is, how abstraction works, what science is, what he calls critical realism, or essentially Thomistic philosophy is, and then it gets into knowledge of sensible nature. And now, finally, we are going to be discussing metaphysical knowledge today. And that will conclude rational knowledge. And then we will start with super rational knowledge. So things like mysticism, revelation, um, all these sorts of ideas. We'll start with part 2 in chapter 6 the next time we do this book club in 2027 or whenever we get back around to it.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the next chapter is mystical experience and philosophy, if I remember correctly. It's dedicated to the Reverend Father Garrigou Lagrange, which is probably also one of the people who is part of the target audience for this book. The guy who wrote like 80 books on Thomistic philosophy. That guy, yeah. So it's you should read it yourself if you're so inclined. If not, well, I hope this helps your curiosity about the contents of this book and Thomistic philosophy.
Mhm. And speaking of that, so again, this today we're doing chapter 5, metaphysical knowledge. I think, as we noted beforehand, he likes to dedicate his chapters. This one, in the most romantic gesture imaginable, dedicated to his wife, Raisa Maritain. I don't know what it says that you're dedicating your chapter on metaphysics to your wife, but it seems, I don't know. They had an interesting relationship, anyways.
Yeah,
I'm sure
you
it was
have to
very
remember.
loving.
I believe they met in what's his name? Is it Henri Bergson? I believe it's something Bergson's lectures
Jackson,
in
yeah.
metaphysics. I believe that's where they met. They met in one of his classrooms. So it's appropriate, certainly for their relationship. It's very romantic to just them. I'm not sure another couple could pull this off. I don't think Edward Fazer or whatever could pull this one off, but
Yeah, not nearly French enough.
not nearly French enough. Yeah, he doesn't get these. He doesn't understand these big, sweeping, romantic gestures of dedicating one chapter of it. Not even the entire book, just one chapter of your book to your wife. Certainly an interesting way to go about things.
Mhm.
Anyway, shall we begin, or do we have any other preliminaries?
I think that's it. I think we can jump right into it. If you want to go
All
ahead
right.
and start, first thing we have, of course, is going to be more terminology because he loves either creating or modifying terms. But yeah, go ahead and jump right in.
All right. So, uh, I took some notes for this one, so I'll be mostly following them. So in the first few pages, he kind of actually has a recap of, I believe, terminology he introduced either last chapter or the chapter before, which is dianoetic, paranoetic, or ananoetic intellection. So going in order, dianoetic is the intellection through which the nature or essence of something is attained through its sensible properties, usually. Or through its properties, I should say, but in corporeal natures, it's, the sensible properties. One thing important to note about this is that it is radial and not central. It is outside in a sense. It attains the essence by the signs it manifests. So dianoetic is I suppose, when you actually grasp the essence of what something is, but through the signs it manifests, because we're humans, our knowledge is mediated for our senses of the world. So you actually get the essence of, like, let's say, what an animal is, and then you get the essence of what a dog is, which is a specific kind of animal, and that's how you do it. But you never attain dogness in itself, because dogness is partly bound up in other properties, or manifested through properties. So it's an indirect way to get knowledge, which is the best we can do with our senses. Paranoetic, which Mariton discussed quite extensively last chapter, is what he called empiriological or empirioschematic knowledge last chapter. It is knowledge by substitute signs. It terminates in the signs themselves, not in nature. So basically, this is, to Mariton, most of science itself. So I think specifically later on, we'll see he talks a lot about, I believe, in chemistry. So atomic weight, um, I suppose valency would also be one of those characteristics. So he talks about all the characteristics that differentiate one atom or one compound from another, and how they're not itself the nature of that atom or compound, they're just the manifestations of it, and that's where our knowledge of them stops.
And I think if I because one thing I wish he did more of, and I think he avoids it because it can be, you can get lost in the imagery sometimes. But giving concrete examples, I think, can be very helpful. So like you mentioned, our knowledge of the essence of an animal, or of dog, or of man in particular. We know the essence of man being a rational animal. We know that, he would say, dianoetically. We grasp that we actually attain that essence completely, like you said, through the sensible. We know what man is because we see man, we see what he does, we see that he uses reason, we see that he is an animal that he has to eat, and all these sorts of things. But we do fully grasp that essence, and we can nicely put it as some little pithy man is a rational animal kind of thing. When you go to, like you said, sort of more scientific things, more empiriological things, what is the essence of copper? What is the essence of an electron? What is the essence of mass? What is the essence
Mm-hmm.
of charge? What can you say about copper? Well, you can sort of give the laundry list of, okay, this is the atomic weight, this is how many electrons it has, this is the structure it forms, this is how it reacts with other chemicals. And you can sort of laundry list, and you can give all this information that kind of surrounds the essence of copper, but never directly. Again, you're doing it through these substitute signs. Is instead of talking about the essence of copper, you can't really do more than talk about its properties. And part of that's because copper isn't a whole lot. Like copper is so much less than a man or an animal.
Hmm.
Because there's less of an essence there to articulate.
There is, I believe, some disagreement with actual modern scholastics. I believe David Oderberg does make the claim, together with, I believe, this is partly with Kripke's argument from modal logic and transuniversals, that H2O, for example, which I think would apply, you can extend the argument to copper, but I don't know it's a chemical compound formation. But H2O is the essence of water, rather. So that if there's something which works as water in another world, another planet, but it doesn't have the chemical compound of H2O, if it isn't that chemical compound, it's not water. And then my question would be to Marathon, well, if we can sort of guarantee that if something is H2O, it has that compound, is it purely imperial schematic, or is there some level of dianoetic intellection to it? So there's some wiggle room and some argument there to disagree with Marathon on whether something is just paranoetic or just dianoetic, or if there can possibly be a mixture of these two in our chemical, even in our chemical or more scientific understanding of these different substances. Which is
Agreed.
an interesting argument, but we shouldn't waste too much time on it, or else we'll just waste time on it.
I will waste a little bit more time on it briefly
Go
though,
ahead. Go ahead.
and just to extend the argument, because again, it's with the things that are sensible to us, water, copper, wood, these sorts of that we actually have direct sense contact with, can certainly get closer to Dianoetic. If it's something like an electron, an atom, where again, when he's writing, he talks about atoms and electrons, and sort of has the parenthetical if they really exist, because we don't
Mm-hmm.
really know at this point. We sort of have some guesses, that sort of thing. And realistically, we're still in the same boat now. Like we have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
scientific information, but I've never seen an electron. You've never seen an electron.
Yes.
All the science sort of works out that, yeah, okay, they probably do exist. They probably are there. But because we only know them, not even through our senses, we know them through the readings that different instruments tell us, that we think we know how those instruments work. And you have so many layers between your own senses and even the properties of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the properties of the thing, like you said, they sort of surround or uh, clothe the essence of it itself. That we're very far removed from the essence of those things that are beyond the sensible. And I say beyond the
Yes.
sensible, they're still material, but like electrons, atoms, photons, whatever
They're
these. Yeah,
beyond the limits of our senses, but they are corporeal and sensible. It's just that not to our senses.
right, right.
And that's all. Yeah, you'll mention it, but that's actually a good rule of thumb to think if something is paranoetic or dianoetic, at least for Marathon, is dianoetic would be something which we can probably know directly through our sense experience and then abstract from it. Paranoetic would encounter another degree of mediation. So it'd be something which we use our senses to read a machine which has different senses, which might even read another machine possibly, which then that tells us about the sensible properties. And then that something like that would be probably paranoetic. So that's a quick rule of thumb for you.
All right, so enough digression.
Yeah, ananoetic is knowledge by analogy. So a quick example would be the five ways of St. Thomas, where our knowledge of God is by analogy because we do not attain the essence of God. We do not attain the essence of being itself. We do not attain the essence of the universals as such, but rather we find them in all things, or rather through all things in the case of God, but in the case of beauty and goodness, we find them in all things, but in different ways. We never get the thing itself, but we can abstract from all of them and see that it is the same thing presented in different ways. So that'd be an example of knowledge by analogy.
And we will, as we get deeper into discussing
Oh,
metaphysics,
yes.
we'll talk more about analogates and analog, We'll get to the Latin terms. Some of the Latin terms the Scholastic uses, I swear they were trolling non-Latin speakers.
Yeah, they were making sure the peasants could never read this.
Yeah.
That was part of their mission statement somewhere. It had to be. Uh, all right, so first we're going back to Dianoetic because Marathon wants to clarify a few things. So, quoting Marathon, it is fitting, moreover, to distinguish two modes of Dianoetic intellection, according as it bears on substantial natures and on the realities which are the object of philosophy or on mathematical entities. So, what he means is, well, you can have Dianoetic intellection of natures, sensible natures, substantial natures, which are the objects of philosophy, or, we could talk about mathematics, and that's a different way of perceiving things. And this is an important distinction because the philosophy of mathematics is quite a big sticking point for many different philosophies. I think, if I remember correctly, Kant had an extremely hard time justifying the reality of mathematics with his system, and a bunch of philosophers get really stumped on it when everything else fits neatly into their system. So this is an important point by Maritain. And his argument or his view is that mathematical objects are grasped dianoetically. They are not paranoetic. They are, quote, deciphered by means of a construction beginning with primary elements abstractively disengaged from experience. So, translating Maritain here, he means that mathematics is an abstraction from, or at least the foundations of mathematics, not all of mathematics, like in the case of imaginary numbers, for example. But if the foundations of it, you start with abstracting from elements in existence, which he talked about in previous chapters, and he named this idea as Praetor real. So you have one unit of a stone, or one unit of, whatever you want to say. You have one unit of let's just say stone. You have one stone, and then you have two stones, and then you have three stones, and then you realize you can add the first and second stone to make two stones, and you can add the first, second, and third stone to make three stones, and then you start to real and you abstract from that. You remove a stone element, so you don't say I have three stones. You say I just have three. That would be the abstraction. You're removing the sensible elements. So they're Praetor real because 1, 2, and 3 can exist, but they never manifest by themselves. They manifest in things with a nature. They're almost accidents of a collection of things, or accidents or properties, which are interchangeable terms for Maritain of the Scholastics. So continuing, construction via the imaginative intuition presents an outside, quote unquote, by which for the mind, by which the essence is attained. So when you construct this universe of just abstracted elements or accidents, this is an outside. We can pretend this is something outside your mind through which you investigate. Which is part of the reason it's dianoetic, because mathematics is radial, as Maritain said before. It goes outside in, and through the very basic concept of addition, you realize you can do subtraction and division and multiplication, and then you go on and on and on and on, and you can get the entire field of geometry just by studying lines, for example. And then quoting Maritain, it is reconstruction in regard to mathematical entities which are essences proper, possible real beings or Praetor real, and construction in regard to those which are beings of reason founded on these essences. So the easiest being of reason, ente rationale, I think he calls it in the previous chapter, which I can think of in mathematics, is imaginary numbers. Because you will not find the square root of -1 in nature anywhere. It's not there. But, if you want to model nature, sometimes if you want to get paranoetic and do an imperial scheme of nature, you might use the square root of -1, or if you want to explore the nature of this, imaginary or this construction, you can also do, you can do complex analysis, you can do crazy stuff with it. But that's construction. And it's reconstruction when you abstract the sensible properties and then you just deal with the abstracted elements, the accidents of a collection. Any comments before I move on?
No, I think that's good. I want to get I want to get into the metaphysics, so I think that's good.
So he goes on to say, leaving mathematics a bit in page 217, that the mind always goes beyond accidents by continually relying on them. So I'm actually going to quote a full paragraph here at the end of page 217. As far as substantial essences are concerned, J. de Tonquédec was certainly right in noting against Husserl that when it is a question of thinking substances, even in the most imperfect fashion, the mind never stops short at the accidents. That would be contradictory. It always regards something beyond them. But on the other hand, a moment is never reached when the mind, having left the accidents behind, passes beyond and discovers the bare substance itself. It is by remaining attached to the accident that it finds the means of seeing beyond them. The mind always goes beyond the accidents, but by continually relying on them. So this is the essence of dianoetic intellection. You stay true to the accidents of something, and you see, in a sense, beyond them, but only by relying on them. You'd never get, again, anyone can identify dogs, but you never just see dogness itself around. You only get dogness by getting the collection of dogs and seeing their properties that makes them what they are and saying, well, they have something in common, and that something in common is dogness.
And this, I think, is related to the point we've made in previous chapters. Is, again, like you said, we are animals. We are physical. So our knowledge comes first through the senses. We do not have angelic intellects. Like an angel would know the essence of something directly. It would be connected to that essence. We have to go through the sensible, and so we never get like, even if we can realize there is an essence there that the sensible is revealing to us, we can never leave that. I don't want to say crutch, because it's more than just a crutch. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's the means by which we know the essence, but we can't leave it behind ever.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much so. And then I'm skipping a little ahead. He has some minor points which I don't think are important to our discussion. To page 219, where he sort of says, I'll just read the first paragraph of the scholastic digression, where
Mhm.
he's going to talk about paranoetic intellection. There is a capital distinction imposed on the mind between two knowledges. There is, on the one hand, the knowledge of essences by signs or accidents, which manifest them, at least in their most universal notes, and this is dianoetic intellection. On the other hand, there's the knowledge of essences by the signs, of which it will be a question below, and which are known in place of the nature of themselves, which in this case remain inaccessible in their formal constitutive, and this is paranoetic intellection. So going to the next page, uh, I'll just yeah. In the case of paranoetic intellection, the properties, in the strict sense of the word, remain inaccessible. Clusters of sensible accidents, common accidents, grasped exclusively as observable or measurable, are taken in their place, in the place of properties proper, like the descriptive properties. If this is Mariton's example: density, atomic weight, melting point, boiling point, spectrum of high frequency, etc., which serve to distinguish bodies in chemistry. So these are all real things about real substances, but they're not properties in the exact sense of the word. They're just measures of things that happen. They don't really lead you to see beyond them. They're just again, an imperial schematic way of distinguishing between different things in chemistry. These descriptive characters are given the name properties, but the import of a name here is quite different and no more philosophical or ontological than that of the word substance in the use of chemists. They are at once exterior signs and masks of a veritable ontological properties. They are imperiological, substitutes for properties, properly so called. The mind cannot decipher the intelligible in the sensible, and makes use of the sensible itself in order to circumscribe an intelligible core that escapes it. It is then that we say that the form is too immersed in the matter to fall within the grasp of our intelligence, which is what we were trying to get to before, that it's not transsensible, it's not beyond the senses, but it's too immersed in matter to fall within the grasp of our intellect. It is impossible by such properties to attain in any degree whatever the substantial nature in itself or in its formal constitutive. It is known not by signs which manifest it, but by the signs which hide it. This is what happens in paranoetic intellection. Any comments?
Hopefully that distinction is clear. Again, it is deep, and it's interesting. He introduces these two just so he can contrast them later with ananoetic intellection,
Yes.
which is going to be the main object of metaphysics, because
Hmm.
we're moving beyond. Whereas, like we said, dianoetic is in the sensible, paranoetic is in the sensible sort of through other means, and ananoetic is going to be transsensible.
Hmm.
So because we're going to have to, at some point when we talk about metaphysics, we're going to have to leave the sensible world.
Yeah, this is very shortly coming up, but before that, he does have a poetic way of putting it, which is that the difference between dianoetic and paranoetic, which is that dianoetic intellection is a case in which the signs manifest more than hide. Paranoetic intellection is a case in which the signs hide more than manifest. He goes on to try and clarify a little bit here. To fix our terminology, let us say that in dianoetic intellection, substantial natures are to some degree known in themselves by signs, which are proper accidents, properties in the philosophical sense of the word. As for these properties themselves, they are known by other accidents, which are the operations, which is beyond the scope of our discussion. In paranoetic intellection, substances and their properties are known by signs and in signs. That is, all that we know of the substance is the signs which it has in paranoetic. Which an interesting this gets a little complicated because there are clearly like water. We clearly know more about it than just the basic chemical makeup of it. We know that that it hydrates us. We know what it tastes like. We know what it looks like to our eyes. We know what it feels like in our hands or our body. We know what it's like to swim or traverse in it. Um,
But
but
again,
in the
these are the
Mhm,
signs themselves that are again what you've done is you've cataloged the signs, you've cataloged its properties.
mhm. But in the
Um,
proper sense of the word, they're not just the measurable accidents. They are things that have in our senses. So we do dianoetically know what water is to some degree, but also when you go to chemistry, we it's just empiroschematic. So we can have one object where we consider it dianoetically, but the scientist, or at least the modern scientist, will only consider it paranoetically.
and it's a question of how deep into its essence you can get it, and like he
Mhm.
says, because what does he say? Um,
It's to immerse
oh,
in the matter to be
yeah, to immersed in the matter
to
is
fall within the grasp of our intelligence.
and it's because and that's I love that expression. Um,
Hmm.
and it, like we were saying earlier, it's because they sort of I mean I love talking like this, but amusing. They be so much less. Again,
Yes, there.
something like a man is high enough in being. There's a unity to our being that our essence is more intelligible, and I mean, saying it's more intelligible, it is more. Whereas the essence of water doesn't really be enough to. It doesn't have that unity of design, that unity of purpose that a man does. Right? There's a unity to our essence because everything flows naturally towards our end, and the ends of water and its level of being is so much lower that it's hard to get, like it's lost in the matter of it.
Yes,
The form doesn't really rise above in the way it does for a higher being like an animal or like a man.
I mean, even biologically, we don't even need to get into the metaphysics of the soul. I mean, water is part of our biological and chemical makeup. So, and
Mhm.
yet our biological makeup is already more than water. It interacts with water, it uses water, it has water. So, in that sense, just its complexity and the number of parts working in there and what it is already more. Much like, let's say, if someone subscribed to the theory of mind that animals are nothing but automatons or something, they would still have to say that, yeah, okay, animals are still more than something like a stone or just liquid water or something like that. There's more to them. There exists more. There's more being to an animal, even if it is like a meat machine or whatever,
Mhm.
than water, just in its biological and chemical makeup. There's more there to be grasped by the senses than in water.
And more to be grasped by the intellect in particular,
Yes, yes, yeah, in
and
particular.
but since there's more to be grasped, like there is more of a definable essence, whereas the essences of those other things are so low that it's very hard for us to grasp them because it's so much less than again the essence of an animal or of a man.
Yeah, the example of meat machine also works here because if it is a meat machine, it is still a machine. So it has if the computer theory of mind is correct for animals, which I don't think it is, but just to extend the example because it's way easier to discuss the actual theory of mind for animals, it's still a machine that operates with very specific parameters. And I believe some insects probably are basically like meat machines. Uh, where they're very, very dumb and they have very fixed operating parameters and they don't function outside them at all. And even then, you have to say they exist more because they have operating parameters which they sort of don't work, and they don't work in a specific sense. That's being alive, and by being alive, they excrete, they reproduce, they seek shelter, they do all these other things. They have societies, even if they are societies of meat machines. They have to cohabit, they have to cooperate, they have to do this in very specific ways because of the way their bodies are, because they're insects or they're panthers or they're whatever animal you happen to consider. There's all these other things that is more information and data for our intellect to grasp than in, well, water flows downhill and it tastes nice, I suppose. Something like that.
Right. All right, we're good. We're good to pick up the pace. We're going. This happens to us every
Yeah,
time as we end up getting.
there
We
is
go. We
a
go half an hour. We go 4 pages. Go ahead.
Yeah, there is a point where I do start going through pages very quickly in my notes. Let me see, word page. Yeah, now we're in the scholastic digression. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to the human intelligence and corporeal natures. Page is 221. In this, my only highlight is in 222 and 223, which is the double movement of the soul into itself, which is Marathon talking about how we get to know ourselves. So, this is coming off a discussion about the how proper it is for us to only know the limits of our knowledge, how they are proper to us, because spirit tends to spirit, pure spirit to pure spirit, spirit involved in the senses to spirit, which is the form of a body. We should understand that our intelligence, which from the fact of its union with the body is naturally turned outwards and towards natures here below, must complete the great periphery of the knowledge of the world, precious, robust, and admirable, ultimately delusive, whether it be philosophical or experimental, to arrive finally at man and the soul. Then, by a double movement, it will penetrate within to take cognizance of the things of the soul and to know the works of man. By reflexive philosophy and by practical philosophy, ethical, cultural, aesthetical, and it will rise above itself to perceive the things of God, to pass on to metaphysics. Such is its natural itinerary, by reason of which the figure of Socrates stands forever at the human crossroads. Any comment on that before I finish this little section? Which
Go
then
ahead.
we
Go ahead
have
and finish the section.
then we get a diagram if we want to talk about it. Well, we should at least show it.
We should at least show it.
But let us return, and I'm going to read probably point 7 entire, but do stop me if you feel like it because it's a paragraph and a half.
Sure.
But let us return to the natures of corporeal things. The universe of a sensible real with its double valency, ontological and empyreological, dianoetic and paranoetic, is, we know, but the first degree of the knowledge we get of these natures, or the area of the lowest abstraction. A second area of intelligibility is that of the mathematic praetorial. Here the mind escapes into a world of entities which were first grasped in the bodies of nature, but immediately purified and reconstructed, and on which other entities, which are indifferently real or of reason, imaginary numbers, will be endlessly constructed. This world frees us from the sensible real, but only because in it we sacrifice any order to existence. Imaginary numbers are not in nature. This is why philosophies, into which geometry provides the only entry, are doomed to idealism. They get forever stuck in the notion that there isn't a matter itself. But there is go ahead.
Oh, I'm gonna interrupt very briefly and just remind listeners that back in chapter 1 or chapter 2, he discusses those 3 degrees of abstraction. The first being physics or physica, the second being mathematica, and the third, as I'll mention in a second, being metaphysica. But go ahead.
But there is a third area of intelligibility, which makes us pass beyond the sensible without giving up the order to existence. And so it introduces us into the more real than the sensible real, or into what funds the very reality of the latter. This is the area of a transsensible or of metaphysics, which follows immediately the area of a sensible real. And so we finally arrive at metaphysics, and I have a few big paragraphs highlighted in this very introduction. Do we have any preliminaries before
Do, do we
we
want to show
arrive?
off? Do we want to show off his
Oh,
diagram real quick,
yes. Should I? How do I share a screen?
if you
Should I do
can,
it?
if you don't mind?
Yeah, I can share a screen. How do I share a screen?
I need
Wait.
to. Do I need to let you?
Window. Yeah. Well, I clicked it now. Okay.
Okay,
I suppose people
there
could
we
see
go.
it now. Can you see it?
There we go. I think we got it up on screen.
Let me zoom in a little. Yep. Yep.
So
That's
as a reminder to the viewers, if you're watching this and you can see these diagrams, if you're not watching and you can't, you're not going to lose a lot of context, because as we've mentioned before, Maritain likes to draw these incredibly complex diagrams that are very clarifying. If you read like 2 pages of footnotes explaining the diagram in detail, they actually don't clarify anything whatsoever. I don't think I'm trying to remember what footnote he discusses this figure in, because I never really saw much discussion of it, and it never, yeah. We can sort of ponder over the different things in here. Again, we have his transobjective and cis-objective intelligibilities, um, the realms of metaphysics,
yep.
mathematics, physics, Dianetic intellection, analytic intellection. But yeah, if this clarifies everything for you, wonderful. Please explain it to us in the comments.
Yeah, it's like a Kandinsky art piece, if you've ever seen those, where it's a lot of circles and lines artfully and aesthetically arranged. Here in this case, it's only two colors, but still, it's and he's also back to the trans-objective intelligible. I don't see trans-subjective here, but I'm sure maybe if I mathematics. Yeah, I need to turn my head around because there's something which is upside down, which I believe is mathematics and quantity.
Quantity, yeah.
Yeah. I need to turn my head 90 degrees to be able to read that one. Yeah, it's certainly a ride to try and decipher a Maritain diagram. It's not something for the faint of heart, I should say. I think this is trying to describe the natural itinerary in picture form, which I had just read, which is it starts with the sensible or physical reality, and you have paranoetic phenomena as a part of it, and then you have dianoetic intellection, which is both in the sensible and in the transsensible, as we'll see. You have the praetor real, which is a realm of mathematics, and then you move on to the right, and to be fair, he put this diagram way too early, I now realize. Then you have being as being, which is the subject of our next discussion, which is the abstraction of being, and that's metaphysics proper. And then finally, you get to ananoetic intellection, which is really when you move on to just metaphysics to theology. And you go to the trans-intelligible, and you get ananoetic intellection, where it is beyond the grasp of the intellect itself. It only knows these things by analogy, whereas in metaphysics, we can know these things through the signs they manifest. That's
Yes,
that's a good a reading as I can give.
yeah. I appreciate the effort that goes into these diagrams, and I'm sure they make perfect sense.
To
But they
Maritain
are,
and his wife, and maybe no one else.
yeah, and if he spends enough time explaining them to you, they would probably make sense as well. But then they're not really a useful tool if you have to be if it takes more words to explain them than he put in the chapter already.
Yeah, if you're a professor in charge of giving a course on Thomistic epistemology, I don't recommend using this diagram. It's not a very didactic tool, to put it quite bluntly.
Mhm.
All right, I'll stop sharing now.
Perfect. Shall we get on to the metaphysical
Physical
intelligible?
intelligible. Yes. All right. So I'm going to read like half of this big paragraph here.
Sure.
Uh, point 8. When things become the object of our intelligence, they do not merely deliver to us their determinate, specific, or generic nature, whether in itself or in an imperiological substitute. And this is the important sentence coming up. Before knowing that Peter is a man, I have already attained him as something, as a being. And this intelligible object being is not the privilege of one of the classes of things that the logician calls genus, species, or category. It is universally communicable. I find it everywhere itself and everywhere varied. I cannot think of anything without positing it before my mind. It imbues everything. It is what the scholastics called a transcendental object of thought. And now, here's just a quick rule of thumb. If you have trouble, because this being is a weird word in English, and there's lots of it's prone to misunderstandings. You can, for the most part, not everywhere, I think, but for the most part, you can replace being with existence. So going back to what I think is the key sentence here, before knowing that Peter is a man, I have already attained him as something, as an existent, as something which possesses existence. That's the important part here. As a being is more, I think, of a correct translation of ente would be being, but you can also use existence here for the most part.
Right.
So, continuing on, it is being which is first known and into which every object of thought is resolved for the intellect, but nothing can be added to it from outside in order to differentiate it. Everything which differentiates it comes from within it as one of its modes, presented to the mind by another concept. Sometimes it is a special mode of being which is opposed to another mode of being that one subject has and another has not, and by which is manifested the infinite multiplicity of essences which divide being. Thus, in the movement of our thought, the object of concept being resorbs into itself the genera and species. Sometimes it is a mode coextensive of being, which every subject has, which has being, and which therefore constitutes an object of thought that is transcendental like itself. So he's saying that one of the modes of being, one of the ways we can consider being and see being is, as we'll see later on, like right now, really, is beauty or goodness. And it's coextensive with being because everywhere that being is, it is also there. So moving on to the other universals, the other transcendentals. Among these transcendentals, a trinity stands out. Being itself, then, in relation to mind, which alone can confront with equal amplitude, being with equal amplitude, the true, ontological, that is to say, being as the expression of a thought from which it emanates, and as intelligible in itself to the extent that it is, and the good, metaphysical, that is to say, being as the term in which love can delight, and is apt to move desire by the very reason that it is. From this we see at once the value and the imperfection of our knowledge, and above all of the idea of being itself in relation to that which which is. The first intelligible formality by which I'm lost already. The first intelligible formality by which that which is, what hell of a sentence, becomes object, and which is attained in the concept of being, imbues everything real, is capable of everything that is, and yet it is attained in the concept of being as already distinct, only by a distinction of reason, so it's a virtual distinction, from the transcendental formalities attained by the idea of the one, the true, the good, etc., which in that which is are identical with it. Another hell of a sentence.
Which in that which is are identical with it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Maybe he could have written that one better, but yes.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. The cat's going a little crazy. Cover
Uh-huh.
for me.
Yeah, no problem. So, what he's really just okay. So this is kind of slightly impenetrable. What this really is, he's talking about the universals. So he's describing the different modes of being which are coextensive, and by coextensive, he really means that wherever existence is, wherever being is, and I'm going to use these terms mostly interchangeably here, you find these other things, which is to say that everywhere that something exists, that there is a nature, a sensible nature, or even a transcensible nature like that of angels, we will find goodness, beauty, truth, etc., etc. And they are, in a sense, they are identical with that which is, but they are different ways of conceiving it.
Right. This is the nature of the transcendental. So something
Mm-hmm.
that something is to this, something bees, something exists to the same extent that it is true, or that it is intelligible, or that it is good. Um, and I remember when I first sort of started studying scholasticism, I think that was such a profound idea to me, especially with relates as it relates to the good. That the more something is, the better it is. The as something is more full of being,
Mm-hmm.
it at once automatically becomes more true. It becomes more good. It becomes more beautiful.
Yes, which is another part, which is an intuitive way to grasp the way that humans are more than water. Our previous argument that there's more to grasp with a human for our intellect than water is also part of the reason why a human being is better or more good, has more goodness to it than just the plain water.
Hmm.
So these arguments are, I suppose, correlated, or at least uh, related in some way.
Hmm. So the other thing, I think he mentions this slightly later. So if I'm stepping on a later quote, please stop me. But
Uh
there's
huh.
he sort of counteracts this idea, because when we start talking about being, one of the tendencies can be to make being just sort of the largest genera. So it's the category that just contains everything,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to which is incorrect, because then
Mm-hmm.
then it actually has no essence to it. It has no being in being anymore. If it's just the biggest category, then it's, if everything is just a different type of being, and there's nothing more to being than that, then you have no more, um yeah, there's no essence to being anymore. Being doesn't do anything. It's just what everything is. So being
Yes,
is more than that. It infuses all that is. Everything
it
that
is.
is
Mm-hmm.
exists before it does anything else.
Yes, it is trans-categorical.
Hmm.
And this also relates to a later point of philosophical ontological intuition, he calls it, which we'll get to quite soon. And in fact, the next paragraph I'll read on page 226
Hmm.
has very much to do with it. It's the first paragraph of that page, where he's going to talk about univocity. He's going to basically talk about univocity and the nature of being and why it's not a genera or a category. Even by the perception of the generic or specific nature, the intellect attains in the individual more than the individual itself. It attains a universal object of concept communicable to all individuals of the same species or of the same genus. And this is called univocal. Since presented to the mind by a plurality of transobjective subjects and restored to them in judgments, it is purely and simply one and the same in the mind. So this would be something like, uh, personhood or humanness. Rational animal would be a universal because it is communicable to all individuals which are human. All individuals which are humans are rational animals. Dogness would be universal because all individuals which are dogs possess it. Unum in multis. It is an invariant without actual multiplicity. So it doesn't vary. This is very important. Realized in several, and by that very fact, positing among them a community of essence. But in the perception of the transcendentals, we attain in a nature more than itself, an object of concept not only trans-individual, but trans-specific, trans-generic, trans-categorical, as if in opening a blade of grass one startled a bird greater than the world. Let us call such an object of concept superuniversal. The scholastics call it analogous, so we're stepping into ananoetic knowledge here. That is to say, realized in diverse ways, but according to similar proportions in the diverse subjects in which it is found. It differs essentially, even as object of concept, from the universals, not only because it has a greater amplitude, but also, and primarily, and this is what is most important, because it is not like them purely and simply one and the same in the mind, let us say monovalent, it is polyvalent. It envelops an actual multiplicity. The bird we spoke of a moment ago is at the same time a flock. So this is what makes it not a category, not a genera, not merely another universal amongst many. It is polyvalent. It realizes itself differently. Nothing which exists quite exists in the same way, but also they all exist.
Yes,
It's a funny way of putting it. It's, we get into a lot of linguistic trouble here. Uh, but I'll read a bit on. Hopefully, this clarifies a little bit. So let
please.
us try and grasp the proper mystery of these transcendental objects. I look at a man and think, this is a being, or he exists. I grasp a certain determinate being, an existence, which is finite, perishable, fleshly, spiritual, subject to time, and, as Monsieur Heidegger would say, subject to anguish, and a certain existence similarly qualified. So his existence is similarly qualified by these properties which he has. But the analogous object being or existence, thus thought by me, outreaches this analogate. So it's not that for example, a human possesses the universal uh humanness in complete form. If it is a rational animal, it has all the characteristics of a rational animal. You can't have more or less. You just are that thing. But existence or being, it goes beyond that. It outreaches the analogate. It outreaches the thing in which I find it in such a way that it will be found also intrinsically and properly in analogates which differ from man by their very being and their mode of existence. Everything that differentiates a stone from a man is a difference of being, just as everything that differentiates a man from a stone. If there are electrons, an electron is a being, finite, corporeal, and imperishable, subject to time, but, as Monsieur Heidegger would say, not to anguish. If there are angels, an angel is a being, finite, incorporeal, and superior to time. Everything which divides these beings from one another is the same being by which I find in each of them, but varied. I simply have to fix my attention on it to see that it is at once one and multiple. It would be purely and simply one if its differentiations were not still itself. Or to put it otherwise, if the analog presented to the mind made complete abstraction from its analogates. If I could think of being without thereby rendering present to my mind, whether I am de facto explicitly aware or not of this is quite accidental, in essentially different ways, some of the others in which this object of concept is realizable outside of mind. It would be purely and simply multiple if it did not transcend its differentiations, its differences. Or to put it otherwise, if the analog presented to the mind made no abstractions from its analogates. In which case, the word being would be purely equivocal and my thought would fly to pieces. I could no longer think Peter is a man and this color is green, but only ah, ah. So what do you, this is actually a very important. This is, I think, the basis of metaphysics. Really, this is when we really get to metaphysics as the study of being as being qua being. And so this is a quite important point to grasp, which is why I have this big quote right now. But trying to think
That,
how do I translate this for our poor audience.
oh, I think it's put very well, and it's just the sort of thing that you might need to sort of meditate on a little bit and really think about. I'm gonna take a lighter tone and just point out one of the footnotes here that drove me absolutely crazy,
I
where
didn't read them, so it's going to
he
be new
talks
to me.
perfect. So he's talking about when he talks about his use of the words analogous and analogate and analog. So this is for clarity of expression. We reserve in this whole discussion the word analog for what the scholastics called analogum analogens, and we designate simply by the word analogate what they call analogum analogatum.
Yep, I see it. Yeah, footnote 12. Yep, great stuff, man.
So yeah, the scholastics differentiated two concepts, analogum analogens and analogum analogatum,
Hell of a
which
language,
again,
lad, man.
it's just Latin is evil. But yes, that's our analog and then the analogate. Um,
Yes, so I'm going to re-emphasize the very key aspects of this passage. So, basically, being is polyvalent. It has multiple valencies, but it is still one. It is one and multiple. How is this possible? The very basic argument, which again, Myriton is only sketching the argument out. I'm sure St. Thomas Aquinas has written entire pages upon pages of this, and so have other Thomists explaining and arguing this in detail. But what he's saying is that okay, so I'm going to back up a step and say how we determine something is different from itself, so that it's multiple different things, is that we see what the specific difference is. So what's the specific difference between other animals and humans? It's rationality. So that's what makes rational animals, humans, different from other animals. That's the specific difference, and that's why we are. I don't know if we'd be another species or genera for scholastics, I forget, but we'd be in another category at the very least. But the differentiation is not inanimality. It's another thing added that makes it different, added or subtracted in the case of animals, because you can also think of it that way. But in this case, in the case of being, the very differences in the modes of being are differences of being. It's not something added or subtracted. It's still being, but differently presented and differently itself. It's hard to comprehend, and you do need to meditate on this. But everything has, but the basic way I can put it is that everything has existence, but everything exists differently. Nothing is, and this is a little bit skipping ahead a little bit, but nothing is, of course, existence itself. Nothing is just that which is. Everything which is, obviously, but it is in a different way from everything else which is. Repeat is 5 times and you might get it. But that's the basic that's the basic way
The
of getting it.
the verb to be in the English language is so insufficient for discussing metaphysics. It's kind of absurd. Like,
But then
this is a case where Latin just works much better when you can talk about ins and enta and like we need more verbs because we just use the same one for 5 different things in English and it gets very confusing very quickly.
yeah, it's kind of funny that he says being would be equivocal if it wasn't this, but linguistically being absolutely is equivocal. It's like 5 different meanings. So it absolutely is, but I know what he's saying. Uh yeah, but the trade-off is we don't have to say the words analogum, analogans, and analogum, analogatum and flunk a scholastic test, because we got them mixed up. So that's the benefit here.
Worth it. Absolutely worth it.
All right, I'm skipping page 227. Do you have any comments on it?
I do not know.
All right. So,
This is
yeah, page
paragraph
200.
10 now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think, yeah, I'll read possibly half the first paragraph and then I'll skip to the third, because I don't think the second is. We can read the second, but it's not that important. I can just sum it up in the sentence.
Sure.
So, point tenor. Such objects, the universals, are transsensible. And I made a little note here that this is the object of metaphysics, that which is transsensible. For though they are realized in the sensible in which we first grasp them, they are offered to the mind as transcending every genus and every category, and as able to be realized in subjects of a wholly other essence than those in which they are apprehended. It is extremely remarkable that being, the first object attained by our mind and things, which cannot deceive us, since being the first, it cannot involve any construction effected by the mind, nor, therefore, the possibility of faulty composition, bears within itself the sign that beings of another order than the sensible are thinkable and possible. Maritain says, well, I know that, determining whether transsensible beings like angels exist is a whole other question, but it does, but just our first intellectual grasping of an object already leaves that door open by our very first move of the intellect in understanding.
Yes.
Which is an interesting way, which is very important for metaphysics, to realize that even in our opening move, there's a lot more in your philosophy than in heaven, than in earth, Horatio. There's heaven as well, which I deliberately omitted from that quote. So third paragraph. Go
Yep.
ahead.
Go ahead. No, please.
Okay. Third paragraph, which is I believe Parmesan is going to explain how we get the principle of non-contradiction and the importance of ontological intuition. As the first object grasped by the intellect, being, it is clear that being is not known in the mirror of some other previously known object. It is attained in sensible things by dianoetic intellection, just as a generic or specific nature is known is known in itself by the property which reveals its essential difference. So an analog, analogum analogans, is known in itself by that one of its analogates, analogum analogata, which first falls under the senses. Our power of abstractive perception goes beyond the analogate itself, which serves it as a means to grasp in its transcendence the analog of which it is only one of the possible realizations. There is, therefore, an intellectual perception of being, which, being involved in the very act in every act of our intelligence, in fact rules all our thoughts from the very beginning. And when this is disengaged for itself by the abstraction of a transsensible, it constitutes our primordial philosophical intuition, without which we can no more acquire the science of metaphysical realities than a man born blind acquires the science of colors. In this metaphysical intuition, the principle of identity, being is not non being, every being is what it is not merely known in actu exercito and as an inescapable necessity for thought, its ontological necessity is itself seen. For it is not a logical principle, it is an ontological or metaphysical principle. It is the first law of being. And that is why, when it is transferred into the logical order, where it becomes the principle of contradiction, you cannot affirm and deny something simultaneously. It becomes the first law of thought. From similar intuitions bearing on the primary aspects of being, and provoked in the mind by some sensible example, proceed the other metaphysical axioms, truths known of themselves by all, or at least by the wise. It is true that many of those who profess to be philosophers preen themselves on putting these axioms in doubt, blissfully unaware that they are cutting off the limb on which they are sitting. They only prove that such intuitions are irreplaceable. Either you have them or you don't. Reasoning presupposes them. And it can lead to them by clarifying the sense of the terms. It cannot substitute for them. So this is the very basics of it's a very funny way of saying metaphysics. Either you have the intuition for it or you don't, and you need to stop doing it.
Well, but also just the these fundamental truths of metaphysics, the what he calls the first law of being, is what becomes in logic the principle of non-contradiction. It's
Hmm.
literally the first thing that is true. It is and first in the sense of causally first, like everything else is necessitated by it.
Yes.
Is if it were not the case that being and non-being were distinct and that things are what they are, um, there would be there would be no rationality. Everything else falls apart. And so when people try and and you'll see this in more modern philosophy sometimes, people will try and undercut the principle of non-contradiction or try and start from other places or try and disprove it, that you literally end up with not realizing that to do any of the philosophizing you've done or trying to develop any logic, you were using non-contradiction.
Yes, which actually goes back to page 127, where he says this: if you deny the principle of non-contradiction, that is, being is not non-being, you end up with saying being is equivocal, and therefore, quoting Mariton, I could no longer think Peter is a man and this is color is green, but only ah ah ah.
Hmm.
You can only make, there's nothing to say. There's
Yep.
just expression, and even then, there's not expression because expression is at the same time something else and not something else and not itself. So yeah, it's a
Thought falls
very good
apart
way.
entirely.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a very good way also of introducing why logic works by not saying it's just, oh, it's just the laws of thought, and the laws of thought, if you go the Kantian route, or at least one of the interpretations of Kant, where you go, well, we can, our mind conditions the world for us, and so therefore the laws of thought are phenomenal. They're only in our mind. They're not necessarily pertaining to the world in itself. Whereas Mariton is saying, no, 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 no. We get logic from the ontological intuition of things themselves. And that's how we start building logic and building our own way of thinking about things rationally and correctly,
We abstract the axioms from metaphysical truth.
which are, this is important as well, intuitive, at least in their
Hmm.
primary elements. Before you can
Yes.
do deductions, before you get to the five ways, because the five ways are, they actually start with empirical elements. There is change in the world. I believe that's the first way. That's an empirically verifiable premise, and it starts with the senses, and then it goes beyond them and does a deduction. But it starts with the intuition that there is change. Whereas if you're, I forget if it's Parmenides or Heraclitus. I believe it's Parmenides. Heraclitus believed everything was changed.
Right.
But Parmenides, it's like there is no change. Change is an illusion because it implies a contradiction. And so if you don't have that intuition, like Parmenides didn't, then you're kind of stuck and you can never go beyond the first step, or you don't even get to step one really, or
Yeah.
maybe you did and then you go back to step
Yeah,
zero.
because you had you had to have step one to have any thought to begin with, and then you
Yes.
immediately undercut it, and again things just fall
Yeah,
apart.
then you take a leap backwards for no real reason, basically.
But and then the other thing that he says at the end, there, I think, is very clarifying. Saying, he says, reason presupposes them being these first principles of metaphysics, but he says it can lead to them by clarifying the sense of the terms, so that we can still understand better, like he's doing here, what we mean by non-contradiction, what these metaphysical realities are. They can be clarified for us through reason, but they are
Hmm.
still essential to reason in the first place. We might just not have realized it until we've done enough reasoning to reflect and be reflexive about, okay, what did we have to know to do any reasoning in the first place?
And he clarifies later on in the following two paragraphs. I'm going to read the second one and excerpts from the third one here on page 229. So this paragraph is going to clarify how these first principles and these intuitions are seen. First principles are seen intellectually, quite otherwise than by empirical observation. I do not see a subject thing in which a predicate thing would be contained as in a box. I see that the intelligible constitution of one of these objects of thought cannot subsist if the other is not posited as implying it or as implied by it. This is not a simple observation as of a fact known by the senses. It is the intellection of necessity. So you have the intellect is evolved immediately here. It's not just the senses and then you deduce from that necessarily, but it's immediately involved. Besides, first principles impose themselves absolutely in virtue of the notion of being itself. Their authority is so independent and so rooted in the pure intelligible, they are so far from being the result of a simple inductive generalization or of a priori forms destined to subsume the sensible, that sensible appearances are in some way disconcerted by them, and lend themselves only with ill grace to illustrate the fashion in which they rule things. I affirm the principle of identity and I look at my face in a mirror. Already it has aged. It is no longer the same. This is actually a very good point that the empirical facts would probably, if you just go by sensible fact, you might be tempted to kind of agree or at least sympathize a lot with Parmenides. And that might lead you astray if you take it beyond a poetic sense. Not Parmenides, sorry, Heraclitus, where nothing is the same. There is no one being, there is nothing univocal. It is always change. Nothing is itself. Because if, as Mariton says quite poetically, I affirm the principle of identity and I look at my face in the mirror. Already it has aged. Already it is no longer the same because the world of the senses, the world in which we live, is constantly changing. There is no such thing as being still or as time standing, you know, quiet. It doesn't just stop. And so, therefore, all we perceive by changes. And so, if you don't stop to abstract and to see what makes these changes possible and to realize that one thing is changing, but it is still one thing changing and not just change, then you might be led astray. Appearances lend themselves with ill grace to illustrate the fashion in which first principles rule things. And finally, these principles are analogous, like being itself. Every contingent being has a cause, but the object of thought cause is polyvalent like the object of thought being. So, for just a quick explanation of this, Mariton assumes you know this, but cause for Aristotelians, there's four types of causation. It is polyvalent, but all of them are causes. So this is another way of trying to understand being itself if you're familiar with the basics of Aristotle's metaphysics and his solution to the problem of change. So cause can be effective, it can be material, it can be formal, it can be final. So final is teleology. If a thing is not made to do something, if it does not have at least some function or purpose, it cannot really do anything. For example, if the heart was not made for beating, you can't really explain or say or understand why the heart is beating and pumping blood. If the lungs were not made for breathing, and that's not their intended purpose, then you can't even really comprehend what they're doing, because to even say they're doing this and to evaluate them as an object that's failing or succeeding, you need teleology. Effective, how do the lungs breathe? How does the heart beat? Material, what's the material that makes up the lungs? How, which is very tied in with the effective causation. Well, they're all tied together, but especially material and effective are very easy to see how they're coextensive with each other, how they're together. And finally, formal, which is what is the form of this thing? What is its formal substance aside from the material, which is very correlated with the final causation. Any comments?
No, I think that sums it up. That sums up both those ideas very nicely.
All right. I think in page 230, I have let me see. Yeah, the error of modern philosophers was my note. Yeah, okay. 11. In one sense, there is nothing poorer than being as being. In order to perceive it, it is necessary to discard everything sensible and particular that cloaks it. Uh, there, in another sense, it is the most consistent and steadfast notion. There is nothing. There is nothing in all that we can know which does not stem from it. It is this steadfastness which escapes those who consider being to be univocal and make of it a genus, the vastest and most naked of all. It would then be, as Hegel saw, at the confines of nothingness, and even indiscernible from nothingness, because it is, on the contrary, analogous. It is a consistent and differentiated object of thought, with which a science deal without, by that very fact, become hypertrophied in a panlogism destructive of essences. So this is the error of all the idealists, which is if I think you touched on this earlier, and
Right.
Marit, yeah, which is if you kind of call being a genus a category, it becomes nothing. There's nothing which you can say of it. There's nothing which you can speak of it. It is at the confines of nothingness itself. It is indiscernible from it because you can't say anything about it. And the other thing which you can't say anything about is nothingness, because it's nothing, because it's not there, it's not
Right.
real. So it becomes like this purely nominal nothing category, where you can never deal with things as they are, because because it's hard to trying to put this into words of failing, but hopefully the audience can intuitively grasp this, despite my failures to express it.
Right. And I think we talked about it a good bit, and I think hopefully it is fairly clear at this point.
Let me see. Is there anything else in page 230? If existence is anywhere found in a pure state, without an essence which receives it, if there exists of whose essence is to exist, existence must there be identical with an absolutely infinite abyss of reality and perfection. So I'm going to try to explain this a little, because it's the basically the ending argument of the second paragraph of 230. It's the last sentence there, trying to see where from where I can start reading, where I don't just read the entire paragraph. Okay. After human Kant, a great many philosophers have refused all proper intelligibility to existence, seeing in it only an empty concept or a pragmatic feeling. It is difficult to come across a more radical error, or one more offensive to the intellect. In the first place, the notions of existence and that of being has an absolutely primordial intelligible content. If existence as exercise does not offer to the mind any other content to be apprehended than existence as signified or represented, so that although the notion of an all perfect necessarily has existence among the number of its perfections, I cannot conclude from that this all perfect must effectively exist. On the other hand, existence as represented is quite another thing for the mind than non existence. There is much more in 100 existing dollars than in 100 possible dollars. But still more, existence is perfection par excellence. Being is perfection par excellence. And as it were, the seal of every other perfection. If it is true that an existing half dollar is worth more than 100 simply possible dollars, and a living dog worth more than a dead lion, doubtless of itself it says only posito extra nihil, but it is the positing extra nihil beyond nothing of this or of that, or of a how do I translate posito extra nihil? I believe nihil is nothing, extra is outside. So positing outside of nothingness, I
Mhm.
believe, is that what is the correct translation, but someone who knows Latin will doubtlessly scold me for this. And to posit outside nothingness, yeah, outside nothingness, a glance or a rose, a man or an angel is something essentially diverse, since it is a very actuation of all the perfection of each of these essentially diverse subjects. Existence is itself varied and admits all the degrees of ontological intensity according to the essences which receive it. If anywhere it is found in the pure state, without an essence which receives it. In other words, if there exists something, a being whose essence is to exist, existence must there, in this being, be identical with an absolutely infinite abyss of reality and perfection. So that's Marathon indirectly is talking about God, obviously.
Yes, and I
Which
think
is a very way to put it.
this is where this chapter starts getting so beautiful because you start understanding and as a reminder, this is metaphysics. This is entirely rational thought. There is no hint of revelation or mysticism here. This is just building what we know from what we like from our first sense experiences, and then abstracting that to being, that we can understand that if there is a being whose essence is existence itself, then it's an absolute abyss of reality and perfection, and you start understanding these um I don't know if glorious is the right words, but these incredible things about the divine, which I think is so incredibly beautiful.
Indeed. Now, go ahead.
So I also love the nod earlier to the ontological argument, which I can't remember if you were on that one or not, but we had a discussion about how sort of ridiculous the ontological argument for the existence of God is when he says, so that although the notion of an all perfect necessarily has existence among the number of its perfections, I cannot conclude from that that this all perfect must effectively exist. And that would be the ontological argument, to say that because an all perfect would have to exist, then the all perfect must exist.
Yeah, I can actually let me see if I can find it. I do actually. So ontological argument is like hilariously easy to to say because it's like you could put it into like 3 sentences just because it's funny. So I'm gonna try to find it real quick. Where is it? Because it's in this same. Okay, here. I believe. Let me see where it is because I remember writing about it, but where is it? Because it's Saint Anselm. Let me see if I can find my notes. Found it, but that's not the ontological argument. That's unfortunate. I really okay here. Yeah, I found it. It's like 3 premises and like 4 sentences of argument. So God is that which nothing is greater than. God exists in the understanding, even of the fool who rejects the existence of God. And any object which exists both in understanding and reality is greater than an object which exists only in understanding. These are our premises. The argument: nothing greater, nothing that which nothing is greater than exists only in understanding. But then, uh, nothing greater than is nothing greater than, because if something exists, it would be greater than this thing. Therefore, you get a reductio ad absurdum. Therefore, nothing greater, that which nothing is greater than, exists in understanding and reality. Therefore, God exists. That's that's the entire ontological argument.
Yep.
That's the
Which
in the Monologion, I believe, from Saint Anselm.
Right, which I think St. Thomas Aquinas explicitly sort of refutes, and Maritain does here, is that they're not. It's not actually a valiant argumentation. It's an interesting one, but it has its flaws. There are better arguments for the existence of God, and then once you show, okay, yes, this all perfect does exist, as Maritain points here, yes, existence does have to be one of his perfections, because if he didn't exist, he would not be as perfect as anything that did exist.
Yeah, I believe a problem with the ontological argument is more of, I actually believe it's valid if you modify it, because it's a problem with Anselm's presentation, where if you modify it with a few more as Marathon calls it, ontological intuitions, such that being is, and then you derive that being is univocal, is not univocal, but it is analogous, that it is one in multiple. You can actually do, I think, the ontological argument to show that this being is God. Or rather,
Hmm.
if you rely, the moment you do the ontological, this primordial ontological intuition, you've already done the ontological argument. You just don't equate it with God.
Right.
So I think it's actually valid, but the way Anselm presents it is in the nerdiest, worst way possible. That is open to refutation in how he
Right.
words it. It sucks. I think it's awful. But I think actually, what is it? Gödel actually had a pretty good ontological argument that it stresses me out because it's not scholastic, but
Hmm.
it is, I think, valid. I need to revisit it, but it's much longer, so it's not like 1 page or 1 page and a half like in the Monologion or
I'm not.
Proslogion. I forget
Yeah, I'm
which.
not familiar. I'll have to look for that because I'm familiar with some of Gödel's stuff and it's very good, but I'm not familiar with his version of the ontological argument.
There is a math professor explaining it 20 minutes on YouTube. So if you just put Gödel ontological argument, you'll find it, and it's like a 20-minute video. So it's not
Nice.
long, and it's very well. It's very production value is pretty good for a guy who's on his porch and using like diagrams, PowerPoint diagrams. So it's
Right.
pretty good. Um, so let me see where we were. Yeah, page 231. I'm just going to read the last paragraph because the rest is, unless you have anything to comment on this huge mega paragraph.
I do not know.
Point 12, yeah. So, like mathematics, metaphysics emerges above time. It is not subject to time. It causes a universe of intelligibility other than that of the experimental sciences and of the philosophy of nature. To stand out in things and thereby grasp a world of eternal truths, valid not for a particular moment of contingent realization, but for all possible existence. And then he's going to talk about a few differentiations here. So, unlike the philosophy of nature, it has no need to find its terminus in the verifications of the sense in order to establish these truths which are superior to time. But unlike mathematics, it always looks in establishing these truths to subjects which exist or can exist. In short, it does not abstract from the order to existence. So this is the important point here. It does metaphysics. It doesn't abstract from the order of existence. In fact, it abstracts in a sense in the mind, but it doesn't abstract in reality. So, quick way to put it is, for example, a number can't exist by itself. It must be a property of something. It has to be a unit of some nature, like the number of angels, the number of people, the number of panthers, the number of dogs in the world, or whatever, or a model for the stress that a bridge will suffer if X number of cars cross over and they weigh on average Y kilograms or whatever. The way these things can exist, but they exist in other things as properties of them. Whereas, but they don't exist by themselves. Whereas in metaphysics, you abstract in the mind to deal with being as being because you never feel, you never sense being just as being. So you abstract it in the mind, but in itself, metaphysics, be the study of being qua being, is the study of that which allows the contingent things to exist. So it is above time. It is true for all time, and it is not abstracted from existence because it is the very thing that makes existence possible. Metaphysics is, in a sense, the study of what makes existence possible. Is one of the ways to look at it, which is why something can be there can be something which is let's say empirically or necessary by what we know of the contingent world. So let's say if I was in Paris at 12 p.m. tomorrow, I couldn't also not be in let's say Washington D.C. 12 p.m. tomorrow. These are empirical contingencies, but as far we know tomorrow, I could be in anywhere, in any place. I could exist anywhere. This is metaphysics, but it's the study of that which makes the existence possible anywhere or anyhow. That's basically what I got from point 12. That's how I'd sum it up.
And then as he points out shortly after that is it's again, if we were to include something like the Prater real or mathematical objects into metaphysics, things that don't actually exist, that would be, I think he says, beneath the dignity of metaphysics. Is metaphysics is about what is, what being as being. So if you had things that were only beings of reason, or things that weren't within contained within metaphysics, you'd undermine the foundations of metaphysics.
Yes. So I'm going to read the last part of this paragraph because it's relatively poetic.
Mhm.
Metaphysics descends to the actual existence of things in time and rises to the actual existence of things outside time. It is not only because actual existence is the sign par excellence of the intrinsic possibility of existence, but also and especially because existence itself is, as we have said, the seal of all perfection. It cannot remain outside the field of the highest knowledge of being. See.
So I want to take a moment real quick. We should make a decision because we're an hour and a half in, and we are not yet halfway through the chapter.
I think we are wait, there's 26 pages left, and I think we did like 18 pages or whatever.
Yeah,
Something like that, right?
yeah.
We can do a little bit more at least, I think. Let's see.
Okay.
To where ought we stop? How many pages do you think we can do? Because my notes are also I like after this I skipped to page 234. I skipped
So
232 and 233.
let's try and get through this sort of bigger section and get to 240 where it starts talking about the divine names, and then we can pick up there next time.
All right, which could be even next week if you're available,
Yep,
because
I think we made
that's
that
fine.
work.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll just take more notes because then we can extend that one out.
perfect.
All right, so he's now going to talk about the metaphysical, transintelligible, and ananoetic intellection. Now, my next note is from page 234 to 235, which is on pure spirits and angels. But did you have anything on point or paragraph 13?
So the main thing is he starts again. He goes into more detail about what he means by ananoetic intellection. That again, this is knowledge by analogy, as we have created beings, we can see things in them, and then from those we can infer. And he starts talking in particular about God. So let's see. Um, yeah, so just briefly a quote. He says, "Thus, the divine perfections are attained by us in the perfections of created being, which, by the analogy of being, makes us pass to uncreated being, which no created mind can naturally attain in itself." So again, we can see things like the transcendentals. We can recognize being and goodness and truth in created things, and then by analogy, we can understand what those things are like in being himself. And again, this is the idea of ananoetic intellection.
Mm-hmm.
But no, that's the only thing I want to add in.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just go to point 14,
Mhm.
where he makes a distinction here. There are three degrees in the ananoetic intellection of things superior to man, which can be distinguished. Only the first two belong to metaphysics, the third is supernatural. And now he's going to talk about on pure spirits and angels, which for most Catholics ought to be the same thing, because I suppose we only really regard pure spirits as angels and demons are just fallen angels. Though, you know, who knows? Maybe there's more. I don't know. That's up to God. They're not me.
Right.
Um, so it is impossible to say that the possible existence, possible to say that the possible existence of pure spirits implies any contradiction. So there's no contradiction in saying that it's possible that angels, pure spirits, exist. For the notions of spirit, knowledge, and love, far from implying existence in matter of themselves, imply immateriality. So knowledge is immaterial, love is immaterial, spirit is immaterial. So by themselves, we already know by our understanding of ourselves, that this reflexive understanding that the natural itinerary, we eventually get back to ourselves, we have immaterial things and they exist. That pure spirits do exist. In fact, we have, abstracting from certitudes furnished by revelation, some well-founded indications of a natural order, which if a random guy finds the census, he might think Maritain is going to get to a weird kooky conspiracy theory about angels acting in the world or whatever, because he's explicitly, you know, taking out revelation, which is an
Mhm.
interesting move on his part here. We are spirits is one of the indications here, substantially united to matter. So we are spirits substantially united to matter. We experience the life of the spirit in ourselves, and that in us it is only at an inferior and wretched degree of spirituality. What is more reasonable than to think that such a life, which cannot arise from the energies of the visible world, knows in an invisible world superior degrees more in conformity with the consistency and vigor connoted by the idea of spirit? Since the course of terrestrial events is subject to a providential government which can modify it at each instance, and I am here talking about the natural order itself, leaving aside the case of miracles, in such a way that the constellation of causes preparing the death of a certain invalid may be little by little diverted by the prayer of a free creature, is it not fitting to think that the world of sensible causalities is not closed in itself, but open to the action of invisible assistants, to whom the free decrees of immobile eternity are perceptible as time unrolls? Which is just a beautiful sentence.
And
Uh,
go ahead. I'll let you
Yeah,
finish.
I'm just going to read the rest of the paragraph. These
Sure.
suitabilities of a philosophical order give, in regard to the natural reason alone, a high theoretical probability to the existence of separated forms. And forms here, for those who have forgotten or are unaware, form is spirit. That which is spirit is form. So the soul is the form of the body, and that is our spirit as well. On the other hand, certain sensible facts which are open to investigation, in spite of their relative rarity in the biographies of saints, in treatises on demonology, in the annals of spiritism, of clairvoyance, interesting that he'd cite clairvoyance, etc., appear as the vestige of this existence in the empirical world, which is as irrecusable as it is disconcerting.
So I find the last point interesting. Is like, and yeah, there's all this sort of evidence that maybe there's a spirit world, which I think that's the part that would probably be most mocked by people trying to pick this apart. I think
Hmm.
it's still very true that there's okay a lot of things like okay what and like he mentions okay why would we think prayer for something would work unless there is a spirit world or spirits that we can try and pray to. When he talks about the death of a certain invalid maybe little by little diverted by the prayer of a free creature,
Hmm.
but in the previous part really just sort of goes into Aquinas's argument about angels is that we have an intellect. It is barely an intellect. Like we were talking about earlier with essences. We only can have essences known to us through physically or yeah our sense experience of the properties and then abstracting the essence from those things, whereas something that is sort of that has intelligence in a purer way than we do would just know essences directly. It wouldn't have to go through the medium of the physical. It could just know an essence by itself.
Yes.
And Aquinas talks about okay, this is what an angel would be like because it doesn't have a physical form. It doesn't have a body. It is a separated form, like you said. It is a spirit. Um, and so it doesn't have sort of the encumbrance that a physical body entails. And so, okay, if we have intelligence. Man has intelligence. Man is a spirit, but it's clearly so limited. Isn't it
Hmm.
reasonable to think, okay, well, like, couldn't there also be a thing that has intelligence? This amazing, um, and I'm trying to think how else to describe it, but just, yeah, that it has this incredible power,
Hmm.
but doesn't have it limited and constrained and circumscribed in the way that man does.
Yes. Yeah, the action of invisible assistants, to whom the first degrees of immobile eternity are perceptible as time unrolls. This is a very beautiful way of putting how the angels operate in our lives.
Hmm.
And then the next paragraph actually makes a much stronger point about the I suppose the nature, not the nature, but why the importance of angels and the understandings of metaphysics. But even if this existence, that is the existence of angels and pure spirits, be taken as simply possible, metaphysics is not dispensed from considering its discoverable laws. He who has not meditated on the angels will never be a perfect metaphysician. The tract on the angels is a theological treatise in which St. Thomas depends on revealed enlightenment, but it virtually contains a purely metaphysical treatise concerning the ontological structure of immaterial subsistence and the natural life of a spirit detached from the constraints of our empirical world. So I actually quite agree with this because, especially in theory of mind, I think Edward Fader is a great book, a great beginner's guide to it. But one of the I guess, most controversial arguments. I believe it's by Chalmers. The concept of the philosophical zombie. It's supposed to be a reductio ad absurdum, but if the argument is correct, it actually if a possible existence of a philosophical zombie that is a something that has the appearance of a rational animal, acts exactly like a rational animal, is indistinguishable to the senses from a rational animal, but has no rationality. It is a meat computer. It has no perception. It has no qualia. It doesn't experience things. It doesn't do things. But if you hit it, it's going to say ow. It's going to cry when it appears to be sad, but it has no qualia. It doesn't actually experience these things. If this is correct, then, well, I clearly have qualia, and yet I behave indistinguishably from this, so there must be something else which differentiates me from a philosophical zombie. Therefore, I have an immaterial component, because a philosophical zombie is purely material, and qualia are immaterial. So
Mhm.
even meditating on something which is supposed to be a being of reason is important for a metaphysician to discover something about real beings, to find out what the specific difference might be between us and something else. So a philosophical zombie could exist. There could be a creation of God or whatever in another planet that is a philosophical zombie. But the difference between us and this philosophical zombie would be qualia. It would be something immaterial, unavailable to the senses.
Mhm. I just also love the sentence that he who has not meditated on the angels will never be a perfect metaphysician. I think
Yes, it's
that is
so
so
good.
well
Yeah.
said.
I'm actually going to highlight that one so that I don't forget it when I inevitably reread this book 10 years. Oh,
I
yeah, I
also
love it.
also really want to, and I might try and I'm going to do it anyways, but we might want to try and make it into something. I'll talk to Caleb, but I would love to do a reading on the tract on the angels because I think it's.
I've never even read a page. Have you read it?
I don't think I've read the full thing. I've seen excerpts from it, but I need to dig it up because I think it'd be a fascinating one to do. Because again, we've talked about it a lot about St. Thomas dealing with the idea of angels, but I would love to. I think that'd be a fun one to do. So I'm
I
gonna
mean,
look into looking.
he
Go
is
ahead.
called the angelic doctor, so I suppose that's for a reason.
There we go.
He's probably
Uh,
not wrong on angels.
yeah. That might be a reading in the not too distant future.
How long is it? Do you know? If
I
that's it,
don't.
do you ever,
If it's yeah, well that'll be the determining factor, I suspect.
if it's Ente and Essentia, it's like awesome, great, we can do it in like 2 or 3 streams max. But but if it's Summa Theologiae, Summa Contra Gentiles, then maybe we can read a few pages and consider those. But even if it's as long as De Verite, we need to tread with a bit more caution. So my next note, and you're gonna have to help me a bit here, is it's all of pages 236 to 240. It talks of our knowledge of God by natural theology, which I believe is all of point 15 and
Yes.
16, and then he goes on to the divine name. So uh here, yeah, how do we want to approach this, because I haven't highlighted a specific passage here.
So let me see.
Because I partly didn't highlight it because I didn't know what to discard here, because all of 15 and 16 is fairly, I don't know if important, but it's all well written and and it builds on itself, so I don't know where to jump in exactly.
Yes, I'm not sure if there's a good quote to go into. Maybe we can just sort of summarize the points that he makes. So I'm looking over it now. Um,
I think it's also here where he makes one of the arguments for God, if I'm
yeah, so
correct.
that's sort of the first thing he goes into is he goes through one. Essentially, it's one of Aquinas's five ways, where it's sort of this argument from intellection or from intelligibility, where he understands that he has. So he puts himself in the shoes of a theoretical philosopher, and this
Should
philosopher.
I read that then?
Yeah, sure. Let's just go ahead and start there.
Yeah,
Or
okay, which I
maybe
believe
that's
it
maybe
might
that
be
second.
all of point 15.
Maybe start with the second paragraph.
Yeah,
Just
okay.
we're starting with a philosopher who was thinking about thought.
Yeah, he's thinking about thought. Moreover, this philosopher knows that his thought, which is a mystery of vitality to the world of bodies, is at the same time a mystery of debility in itself, for it is subject to error and to time, to forgetfulness and to sleep, to distractions and to apathies. More still, in its very structure, it suffers conditions of servitude hardly worthy of thought. It is not transparent to itself. It beats against objects that remain obscure to it. It must needs divide, compose, construct, logically elaborate data that are not logical, but real. What need has an eye for logic? It only needs to be opened. Finally, by this very awareness of this servitude, our philosopher knows that thought taken in itself and in its pure formal line has exigencies of a transcendent order, the ultimate term of which he is able to determine. He has learned the true lesson of modern idealism. He has understood that the latter, born as it was of the scandal that man's thought is not pure thought, thought in itself, remains a marvelous witness to the privileges of pure thought. Absolutely pure thought is, for itself, its own object. It is absolute spontaneity. It is absolutely self sufficient. For it to exist is but to think, and to think, not a thing, but the very act of thinking. If for it there are things, it receives nothing from them. It makes them. And so it is clear to our philosopher that he himself is not thought, thought in itself. He is not thought. He has thought. But if he has it without being it, does he derive it from something other than himself, from a cause? The principle of causality does not arrive from a parceling out of the sensible, but from necessities intuitively grasped in being. From the moment that there are diverse things, no one suffices unto itself to exist. Otherwise, it would be the all. It is necessary, therefore, even though we have never seen one billiard ball bumping on another or become conscious of muscular effort, etc., that it depend on another without which it would not be, and in which it finds its own sufficiency. In the case at hand, the philosopher may be said to experience the non sufficiency of his own thought unto itself. Of course, he does not experience the insertion into it of the creative activity which it depends. But he cannot think this non sufficiency unto itself of his own thought without knowing that his thought depends on another. It depends, that is to say, not only on the material conditions, that limit it from below, but on a certain unknown from which it holds its very actuality and its being as thought, and which is itself, consequently, thought or superthought. In me, with me, it causes my act of thought insofar as my thought has being. Thought of which my thought, and would it remain my thought, would be but a moment. So my thought would be a thought of this thought for a thought itself for a moment. Then it would share in the weakness of my thought if it was my thought for a moment. And it in its most multiplicity, and it would have to be said that it has not its sufficiency in itself, that it is caused itself an effect of another thought. I do not know if such an assumption has any meaning. But in any case, though an infinite series is certainly not impossible of itself, a regression to infinity is not possible here. For we are looking for a reason of being. And to say an infinite series is to say precisely no reason of being, each term going back to another endlessly. There must therefore be a thought which is thought, and which is the first cause of my thought. From it must be excluded absolutely any relation as a stuff or any material causality whatever with regard to my thought. It is a cause which compensates with its pure efficiency the whole being of my thought, and is absolutely separated in its essence from that same thought. It is the absolutely uncaused thought, capital T, itself, which causes in me and with me my act of thought. I already glimpsed the proper conditions of such thought, which has itself as its existence and as its object. Now I know these privileges are those of an existent real, absolutely self sufficient for existing. It is pure act, and therefore infinitely perfect. Knowing that it exists, I deduce its infinite perfection from its aseity. It is by a palpable sophism that Kant claims that such a deduction depends implicitly on the ontological argument of Descartes and Saint Anselm, and lies in ruins with it. The ontological argument does not at all consist in the identification of existence a se and total perfection. It consists in the claim to deduce from a simple idea of the all perfect its real existence. If I know, first of all, and in another way, starting from such a fact as the existence of my thought, that being a se, being itself exists, I am obviously justified in concluding, without the least recourse to the ontological argument, that since the notion of aseity involves that of total perfection, and vice versa, this being a se, being itself, which exists, is effectively all perfect. So, do you want to unpack
It's
that?
it's a lot to go through, but I think it is just it's so like I'm always very moved by this. So what he is going through here is,
Yes.
again, it's essentially this argument from intelligence, that we have thought, that man has thought. He notices that thought is, as we talked about previously, is immaterial, as the intellect is not made up of things, is it's spirit. We are spirit in this sense, but we are not pure spirit and we are not perfect spirit. Again, our thought
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work like perfect thought would. It doesn't know some things. It can fail us from time to time. We can make errors. We can make mistakes. We don't really understand where it comes from. We so it's it is not perfect thought, but we
Mm-hmm.
have thought. So if we have thought, where does that thought come from? Because we aren't thought itself. So where do we get thought from? And we must get it from something that actually has thought in those ways that we don't. And then, like a lot of the Thomas Aquinas's arguments, it relies on this idea. Okay, if we get it from somewhere, and then that gets from somewhere, we can't have this infinite regression. Is there must be an ultimate cause of our thought, which is not itself does not itself have of another cause. So there must be some perfect thought that is the source of thought, that we sort of participate in the thought of when we think. And we end up using the word thought and think over and over again 7 times in the
Mm-hmm.
same sentence, so it gets a little
Yeah,
tangled.
yeah, you can also substitute spirit because that's what the idealists do. What Hegel did, he substituted spirit for thought, which in a
Yep.
sense works because I think Maritain is not just saying what the act of thinking or intellection. He's talking about the entire immaterial aspect of your being, your spirit,
and
your form.
and I think in German it's essentially the same word, like you say Geist for either one of them.
Oh, okay, that's why it's translated as spirit. That makes sense. I wasn't aware.
I think that's the case. I mean, in German, they like. I think they like in English they're two very distinct concepts. In German, you can use the one word, so thought and or mind and spirit are there. They both end up being Geist in German. So for someone like Hegel, it ends up being a little bit more confusing.
That makes
Um,
sense. Okay.
but then so we get this regression to perfect thought. It's thought himself, to perfect intellection or perfect intelligence, that is thought and thinks perfectly, and it doesn't have anything that it needs to think about. It thinks thought, absolutely perfect and self-sufficiently and spontaneously, like he says, um,
If
which
for it,
is
yeah, and if for it there are things it doesn't receive from them, it doesn't receive the impression of a sheep or a wolf, it makes them by its act of
yeah,
thinking.
it literally thinks it into existence.
Which is why God is a mind. The mind of there isn't a thing as
Yes,
God. The mind of God is a separate part of God. God is a mind. God is the act of being, and the act of being is the act of thinking. And so all of existence is thought into being
yes.
in a way, analogically, of course. But
Mhm. But yeah, this is how, like, so the different ways of Aquinas for the existence of God. And again, we sort of have this. We break being down into these transcendentals, is that we see being through different lenses, but that we see, because in God they end up, and we'll get into this. I guess it'll be next time at this point. But in God
hmm
they're all the same thing, because all those perfections they have converge into just being itself. But he is pure act. He is necessary being. He is pure intelligence. He is pure intellection. He is perfect intelligibility. But like you said, he is thought. He is perfect thought itself, which is perfect act, which is perfect being. So yes, God is mind, capital M, mind.
yes, the mind.
Mhm.
And
Uh,
this is not the ontological argument as well. It's a
yes, and
it's
that's the nice thing at the end is okay. Once we go through this, and the claim of Kant is that this is somehow relying on the ontological argument, and Maritain points out that this is not the case. That we realize, okay, I think, thought clearly exists. Thought came from somewhere, and then from that I can deduce, okay, what are the properties of that ultimate source of thought? Whereas the ontological argument says, okay, there must be some ultimate source of thought. So like it kind of goes the other way around. So we don't actually have to rely on this idea of, okay, well, I can think about a thing that is the ultimate source of thought. So this is the properties that would have it. It would be perfect. I because I start from saying, okay, I know that I think, and I know that that thought must have a source, just like in the argument from causation. Okay, I know
Yes.
that this thing must be caused by something. There must be there must be an uncaused cause.
This argument starts from not sensible data, but data immediately and primordially available to us,
Mhm.
whereas the ontological argument necessarily starts with the idea of God and how the idea of God implies necessarily
Yes,
his existence,
yes,
which it does, but it doesn't imply his existence in action. It implies his existence if he exists, which is a weird way of putting it.
yes,
But yes, but it's true, and it's not
yeah,
convincing unless you have one of the other ways of getting there. And the nice thing about this argument is that you can literally substitute the word being or existence, and it still works perfectly. It's the different argument. So you could just
mhm,
say he knows he has existence, but his existence is not perfect. It's limited in all these ways. So he isn't existence itself. He has existence. So how does he have existence? So how does he have it? He must get it from someone who does, or something which does have existence. And if you go on the series, you can either immediately arrive at that which is existence itself, or eventually go, well, I guess there must be existence itself at the end of the series because it can't go on infinitely because there has to be a reason of being,
right.
which is a nice part of this argument that you if you get tripped up by the word thought, you can just substitute it for being or
Mhm.
existence.
And the nice thing is that here, it reveals to us something else about the nature of God. That, like you said, he is perfect. He is pure act, but he is also pure mind. He's also pure
Yes.
intellection.
Yeah, to be act is to be pure, to be pure act is to be pure mind,
Yes.
which would be, yeah, how do I there's a I don't think I'm going to remember the phrase, but if yeah, I'm not going to remember right now, but I think it was when Edward Fraser's Five Proofs of God. Whereas, if there is such a thing as a mind, it is God, not ours, in a sense.
Right.
If it is being itself, which is closer to the idea of a mind than us, because of course he is a perfect mind, while
Mhm.
we're not. We're a very limited mind immersed in our materiality. I am tempted to read all of 16 because it is very beautiful. But if you
Let's
want to
go ahead and
veto
read the whole
parts of
thing, and
it,
we'll close off with that. Yeah. So go for
yes,
it.
because it's very, very beautiful. It's appropriate to end on point 16, I suppose.
Sure.
Now, just what has been affected by such reasoning? It has necessarily involved raising to the pure state the analogous and polyvalent object of concept, thought. And the superior analogate thus attained as absolute thought, capital T, infinitely surpasses the concept of thought, lowercase t. Since it is not only thought, damn, he's gonna repetition of words, man. Since it is not only thought, but being per se, and every perfection belonging to the transcendental order. And since it is all that in absolute simplicity and unity. So thought is being, thought is act, thought is the all the perfections of a transcendental order. Thought is God. It is what the analogous concept thought signifies. That and infinitely more. St. Thomas's ways do not terminate at a first of a univocal series, at a first cause, which would be a thing like other things, a cause like other causes, a being like other beings, greater, higher, more perfect, yet circumscribed as they are by the concept of being. That is why the criticism of them formulated by Monsieur Edouard Leroy is a veritable ignoratio elenchi. They lead to a first without any common measure with the second and with the whole subsequent series. To a first separated, isolated, in infinite transcendence. Anoetic intellection crosses the infinite abyss which separates it from everything. But the analogous concept it uses avow at the same time their impotence to enclose or delimit the reality they then designate. Ut omne genuflectatur, which to translate means all will bow. They make God known only by kneeling before him. May we be permitted to point out what delicacy, what filial fear is apparent in the very word ways used by St. Thomas. These ways are proofs, demonstrations. But when we are dealing with things proportionate with or connatural to our intelligence, demonstration, while all the while submitting to the object, also in a certain way, subjects the object to our grasps, to our means of verification, which measure it, limit it, define it. It seizes the object, touches it, manipulates it, judges it. This is all the more obvious the more material are the procedures used. And perhaps scholastics, who have inherited a high notion of a chaste science, whose very rigor and strict intellectuality derive from a religious respect, and an exigency for purity in the face of being, and it is their mission to maintain this notion as a sacred good. Perhaps they sometimes forget how charged with materiality have become the words science, demonstration, proof in the usage of the moderns. Ever since thought turned above all to the domination of sensible nature, and since to verify evokes for modern thought only methods of measurements and laboratory apparatus. When they decline, as they ought, to accept a degraded vocabulary, they run the risk of insufficiently explaining their own terminology. But in any case, they know that to demonstrate the existence of God is neither to subject him to our grasp, nor to define him, nor to seize him, nor to manipulate anything except ideas which are inadequate to such an object, nor to judge anything except our own proper and radical dependence. The procedure by which reason demonstrates that God exists puts reason itself in an attitude of natural adoration and of intellectual admiration. Everything has changed since the Cartesian clear ideas, which dissipated into thin air any ananoetic intellection and any knowledge by analogy. Since then, to enter into mystery by the intellect has become a contradiction in terms. If the Cartesian reason, which wholly suspended from God, does not wish to treat God as a thing subject to it, it must submit to him with closed eyes, and only open them when it turns to the created and the finite. It is in this sense that Descartes never treated of the infinite except to submit to it. Hence that great movement of holy flight, which precipitated him towards things below. After him, Malebranche and Leibniz will apply that same reason, which knows only by judging according to its own measure, to the justification of God. What had been called natural theology will henceforth be called theodicy, and, setting out to comprehend the divine ways in order to render them acceptable, will religiously prepare the way for atheism. All that he has done is well done because it is he who hath done it, said Christian reason. It is he who hath done all, since it is well done, and since I know why. And besides, he is bound to do the best, says Leibnizian optimism. Materialized and corrupted scholasticism, which would not only have seemed impious, but absurd to Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, I'm glad we read that whole thing. That's
Yeah, I needed
fantastic.
to read that whole thing. I can stomach cutting any of it out. It's just really good.
And a couple of points over there, because one of the things I really like is he talks about how there's this what he calls filial fear, um, in which Saint Thomas talks about his ways of knowing God, the five ways, and instead of the five proofs for the existence of
Yes.
God. And as he says, there's this sort of um, when you talk about demonstrating something or proving it, the idea is you circumscribe it, or you contain it in your discussion. And as it points out with any of the discussions of the existence of God, everything you do is going to be inferior to that perfection, that
Yes.
infinite transcendence.
Ananoetic intellection, as he says, is itself a kneeling before God.
Hmm.
It is This is why the idea of it, well, what caused God? It's the whole criticism. He's basically making fun of the what caused God
Hmm.
criticism in the second paragraph of 239, where he says, well, the first cause is a different kind of cause, or its very object is of a whole different order. It is isolated in infinite transcendence. It is uncaused cause, or it is caused by itself. It is not like other things which need a cause for their existence. It is its own justification. It is infinitely transcendental. And we can only get to it by knowledge by analogy. So we only know him, they make God known, and a noetic intellection, only by kneeling before him. Such a good quote, too.
That's really good.
They make
But
God known only by kneeling before him.
but at the same time they are proofs, like, through
Yes,
these ways we do know the existence of God irrefutably and through the use of reason. It's not because as he talks about, the way the modern usage sort of happens. And I've discussed this with people who have this sort of confusion that don't that they hear about the five ways of Saint Thomas, and think of it as like a kind of a, oh, that's an interesting thing to think about, or and instead of a, no, like, this is why the church affirms that if you say the existence of God is not known by reason, let them be anathema.
Yeah,
Like,
First Vatican Council, if I remember
yes,
correctly.
that's right. That no, like, these are ironclad proofs that God does in fact exist as the church understands him. Um, and there's a humility in the way that these things are phrased, because again, with like, it is
Their
somewhat,
ways,
yeah, but
in a
there's,
sense, because of how do we put this? What's the word? A connotation of
yes.
the word demonstration, as he says, it's material, it subjects the object to us. We are that which rules over that which we are determining. We are the judges here. Whereas in with St. Thomas, the procedure by which reason demonstrate that God exists puts reason itself in an attitude of natural adoration and of intellectual admiration.
And
And
I
I think
love that
that's
as
yeah,
well.
and I think that's fairly important because of his point in the following paragraph, because it's a very subtle difference between what he calls Christian reason and Leibnizian optimism. And it depending on phrasing, you can, as St. Thomas says, and I believe, is it ante descenso or de veritate? I believe it's de veritate, where it's a small error in the beginning can lead to a huge mistake at the end.
Hmm.
Where even if you get the wrong impression and you follow with that wrong impression, you're going to end up very differently. So Christian reason, this is worth rereading because it if you might not get it in the first read. Christian reason says that all that he has done, he is God, all that he has done is done well because it is he who have done it. Leibnizian optimism says it is he who has done all, and since it is well done, and I know why, and besides it, he's bound to do the best. So he's bound to do the best is an afterthought, and I know why it is well done, and then I can say God has done well. It becomes, he's quite correct in saying that theology becomes theodicy for Leibniz, and
Hmm.
going on from there, because you're trying to justify God by that first finding the natural world, justifying the natural world to some sense of reason or ethics, instead of going on to first what is goodness in itself, seeing that's coextensive with being, seeing that being qua being, or being per se, being itself is God, and God is thought, God has all the perfections of the transcendental order, and then saying, well, very well, then if the world is created by God, God is goodness itself, that's the nature of God, then I know that it is done well because it is he who hath done it, and not something else, not in like a Gnostic archon or daimon or whatever terminology, because it is he has done well. Whereas the Leibniz says, well, I know these things are good, and then I skip a few steps and go to God, because I don't have the same idea, because I don't think Leibniz had exactly the same idea of God as being something very weird but kind of similar. He's weird. I never really understood Leibniz, where he has monads. I'd never understood monads either. Very bizarre. Anyway, where you have this idea of, well, things are good and I know God made them, so therefore, I guess he does well. It's an I guess he did pretty good.
Yeah. Um, so I think we'll, like, again, we're right at the 2 hour mark.
Yeah.
We're a little bit more than halfway through the chapter. I think we'll try and finish this up, starting with the divine names, probably sooner rather than later. We'll see what Caleb wants. We might try and blend them together for a long release, but I know it's late here and later where you are. The one thing
Well,
I want to just read that sentence again, because I think it really sums up how this whole chapter affected me. Where he said, "The procedure by which reason demonstrates that God exists puts reason itself in an attitude of natural adoration and of intellectual admiration." And I getting into metaphysics and where the book is going from here, which again, after this chapter we're going to start getting into super irrational knowledge. So we're going to be getting into revelation and mysticism and contemplation. But that I definitely feel that natural adoration that comes from understanding and again, he used the word understanding loosely, the ways in which we can know God through reason, puts one an attitude of natural adoration. Like I absolutely feel like this, and as a reminder, adoration in the Christian sense, or in the original Catholic sense of the word, is that love that is reserved for the triune God. It's that love for the transcendental, for that thing
Hmm.
that is all perfect. So when we talk about Eucharistic adoration, or we talk about adoring God, we talk about that special kind of love that is entirely reserved um, for pure act, for the pure, for being Himself. And reading this chapter more, and just in general with Maritime talks about physics, I think it strikes me. But this chapter definitely put me in that attitude, because I think it is.
Yeah.
I'm very moved by that deeper understanding. Because, like you said, the we understand God by kneeling before Him in this sense, like intellectually, and
Yes.
I think it is so humbling and so beautiful, and that's definitely what struck me most in this chapter, was that attitude.
Yeah, that attitude is very visible in Marital, which is a very admirable quality in a Catholic writer.
Hmm.
To be able to, even in a very intellectual academic book, to be able to pass that attitude on is very impressive and even admirable, in the sense that it makes me want to do that in whatever professional environment or academic environment I work in, because it does seem at least somewhat possible to do so. Even, you wouldn't think of an academic book of epistemology would have that much to say on, I suppose, revering or respecting God. And he doesn't say that much on it. It's just his entire attitude about it.
Hmm. No, absolutely beautiful. So I think, yeah, we'll leave off there. We'll pick
Hmm.
up and finish this chapter shortly, and then, like I said, hopefully it'll be a week turnaround on this or something like that. But I know it's late for both of us.
Yeah, it
Any
is.
final comments?
So far, well, let me see. Well, I know the next time we're going to get into the divine names and a lot into the super analogy of faith, I believe. And we're going to get into a lot of very nitty gritty of ananoetic intellection, which is more than I ever thought I would know.
Oh, well, and also the nature of personality,
Oh yeah,
personhood and personality.
that was what most stuck with
Yes.
me. That's what I'm most looking forward to rereading and taking notes and discussing. It's his, I suppose, intuitive argument for why the Trinity works, because that's what it is
Hmm.
at the heart of it, is, or at least that's what my main takeaway, or that's the most practical aspect for a Christian philosopher, someone who likes Christian philosophy, is his argument and his observations about personality and immateriality and the limitations of materiality and personality. So that's what I'm most looking forward to. But if I had, I guess, one thing to really stick with this chapter, would be how being is itself in multiple, how the transcendentals, the super universals, are coextensive with each other, and therefore each different modes of perceiving the same thing, and how all of those are at the same time, or are being itself, and that everything therefore participates or has being, but it is not being. That's the main point of this chapter, aside from the categorization of dianoetic, paranoetic, cananoetic. That's, I think, the important thing to take away from is his arguments concerning being.
All right. Um, Always a pleasure, Bulge. We will do this again very
Hmm.
soon.
Hopefully.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this. We're going to keep doing them whether you're listening or not, because I'm enjoying this book a lot, and it's nice to be able to have a motivator to keep me reading what is a difficult text,
Oh yeah.
and a chance to discuss it. So we will see you guys next time, and yeah, later.